Yeah, my name's Craig Morrison, and I'm a Delta airline pilot and have been so since 1972. I'm currently work as an instructor pilot in the flight training department, teaching people to fly DC-9s, give check rides, and whatever else that comes along.
And you're also involved with a group called Sky Warriors. Can you
Sky
tell me
Warriors,
about
right.
that?
Sky Warriors is totally different. It was started by a fellow that was in my pilot training class with Delta and another guy who's an airline executive, and they basically wanted to show people who were interested in air combat what it was all about, the civilian population. So for a certain amount of money, they can come out here and we give them a full military briefing, put them in the front seat of an airplane. It's a P-34, it's an old Navy trainer, Air Force trainer also, and it's been rigged with a gun sight, and instead of a gun, it has a laser that will activate a smoke system on the other aircraft when it's hit. So it's basically aerial laser tag, if you want to look at it that way. But essentially, most of the people that come out here because they want to experience what it's like to be in an airplane, either in formation or in aerial combat with another airplane. I mean, they've all seen Top Gun 2 or 3 times, probably more than that, and they've always wanted to be a fighter pilot. So for a day, we let them be a fighter pilot, and all of the instructors out here are former fighter pilots, and are just doing this on our days off. I think, as I said earlier, I was at the Delta simulator this morning, and here I am this afternoon out here just doing this because it's a pretty day, and there's somebody that wants to sit in the front seat, and I don't mind sitting in the back seat. Some of them are pilots, and it's amazing. Some of them are totally non-pilots at all. They just come out here and want to do it.
Where do you live?
Here in Atlanta, just north of Atlanta.
And tell me about your family.
Right now, I'm by myself. My kids are grown and gone, and one's a senior in college at Sewanee, University of the South, and the other's a freshman up at Ithaca, New York. So.
Okay, now let's talk about the present. We'll go back a few years into the past.
Okay.
And can you tell me about how you got involved in I know where you're at, so I don't know if I'm going to phrase this right, but I'll phrase it the way I phrased it for everybody else, and you can go on to explanation. Can you tell me how you got involved in the Vietnam conflict?
Sure. My involvement in the Vietnam conflict was basically started when I was in college, by virtue of when I graduated from college, 1965. I actually started off as a Marine Corps PLC, which was officer training in the Marine Corps, and then they had Air Force ROTC, and I determined that I would have a better chance of flying in the Air Force than I might have in the Marine Corps, since all Marine officers are first ground officers and then pilots. So I went in Air Force ROTC, graduated from college in 1965. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was in 1964, 65. So basically, what happened was that I was automatically involved, and being in the military as an officer and then going to pilot training, there was no doubt when I was involved. I started off flying fighters. I had a fighter assignment out of pilot training, and then that got changed around what the military wants to do. So I ended up flying fighters, and I ended up flying the transport airplanes, C-141s, going back and forth to Vietnam. And then I went back to Vietnam as a forward air controller and spent some time at the Central Highlands of Vietnam, and then ended up going over to Laos, which I'll talk about shortly.
Some of the business stuff, and I'll think about all that stuff too.
You mentioned that you were in Air Force ROTC. Why did you choose to go into ROTC?
My mother stole an airplane in 1947, I think, 48. My father was a pilot, had his own airplane, and I just wanted to fly airplanes. It says somewhere in the Raven book, Sewanee, University of the South, is fairly intellectually oriented. Most people go into graduate school. And I think I had 3 goals that I had long since forgotten, but I told the author of this book when I graduated from Sewanee, they were to drive fast cars, fly fast airplanes, and chase fast women. And the ROTC seemed like a good deal. They were going to send me to pilot training and teach me to be a fighter pilot.
You graduated in 1965. What training did you go through before you first went over to Vietnam?
By the time I first arrived in Vietnam, I probably had 250 or 300 hours flying in the States, training, various and sundry types of training aircraft, that sort of thing.
And when did you first get over to Vietnam?
February of '67 was the first time I set foot in South Vietnam.
So you spent a year and a half after you graduated, a little bit more than a year and a half, going through training and spending time in the United States. From February 1967, when you came back to the States, when? After?
I came back in April of '70.
April 70. So you spent a little bit over 3 years there.
Some of that time was in 141s, which was over and back, in and out, so to speak. But I think I was in Vietnam at least once a month for almost all of that time, with the possible exception of 2 or 3 months when I was transitioning from one airplane to another back in late 68, early 69.
Okay, so from February 67 to late 68, early 69, you were flying fighter and C-141
Right.
back and forth.
Right.
What was it like when you came back to the United States? Did you walk around in uniform, or did they tell you not to do that?
A lot of things transpired in the period of time that I was associated with the war in Southeast Asia, but the first part of it, in 1967 and 68, is probably, everyone seems to have a clear understanding of how anti-war the country turned and all of that. But if you look at some of the earlier documentaries, I mean, there's this great documentary of Walter Cronkite, just as fired up as he was when he was broadcasting from London, and he was going on a B-57 mission out of Da Nang, which was about 66, 67 perhaps. In other words, the country didn't start out against the war in Southeast Asia. It was an evolutionary process. I went in the Air Force in 1965 and I got out in 1970. That by itself is somewhat insular, in as much as the time I was in Vietnam, I wasn't particularly aware of what was going on in the United States, at least not to the degree that it was impacting me directly. Going back and forth when I was in the 141 business, going back and forth, I was more or less on an Air Force base most of the time. So you could see it on the 6 o'clock news, but it didn't impact me directly. It did later, but it didn't at that time.
What was your family situation during that time?
I was married and had a son who was born during that period of time. He was born in October of 68.
And how did while you were flying back and forth, did they live on an Air Force base?
Yes, or at least in Charleston, South Carolina, which was adjacent to an Air Force base.
So did your wife experience any of the problems or protesting during the time that you were over there?
No, I don't think so. Not much at all. Because there were, her circle of friends was my circle of friends, and there were other military pilots.
Okay, at late 68, early 69, then you switched to doing a different sort of mission.
Totally.
Could you explain how you got involved in doing that mission and what you were doing?
The way I got involved, the how was very simple. They were looking for fighter pilots. Good. They were looking for guys who had fighter experience to be forward air controllers. And if your class is not familiar with what a forward air controller is, unlike the war in the desert where the targets are plainly visible, in the war in Southeast Asia, when it was primarily a guerrilla war and the enemy was frequently dispersed and hard to see, from a fighter going 600 knots, you can't see much, first of all. Secondly, you don't have much time on the target because the jet airplanes burn a tremendous amount of fuel at low altitudes. So you may have 10 minutes on the target. Well, you can't see enough in 10 minutes to accurately drop bombs or whatever where you want to. Especially when you're dealing with what we call the troops in contact situation, i.e. Americans on one side and Vietnamese on the other. You know, there's too much in the way of the opportunity for killing your own soldiers. So what they did is they got guys that were fighter pilots and made them forward air controllers, put them in light airplanes, and I flew 2 or 3 different types of light airplanes, and was basically an air traffic controller, if you want to look at it that way. You flew, you found the target, you had your own area that you were responsible for, so you knew the ground. If somebody went barefoot across a particular creek, you'd see it, because you were there all the time. If you found the enemy that attacked friendlies and so on and so forth, you were there. You'd talk to the ground people on the radio. You would talk to the fighters on the radio. You would frequently talk to the command post back on the radio. You may have somebody else in the airplane. In Laos, we did as a translator. And then you would direct the strikes. So when you see a fighter rolling in, the forward air controller would say, you're cleared in hot. And unless the fighter heard that, he was not authorized to let loose any of his ordnance.
Were you assigned in Vietnam? Were you stationed?
Yes, I was stationed at Pleiku, which is in the Central Highlands. Being a forward air controller was probably one of the better jobs from the point of view of seeing what was going on with the entire war, because you were not just isolated in the fighter pilot community where you landed at a fairly big base and all that. You weren't completely out there with the Army, but you were in both places. So you got a chance to see a little bit of both. However, flying a light airplane over the jungles in Vietnam was not conducive to a long life. So, you know, a lot of guys got killed doing it, too.
What were your living conditions?
They varied. Pleiku was pretty good. That's pretty high up. I mean, it wasn't exactly like Saigon, but it was pretty nice, relatively speaking. We got mortared a lot. We got rocketed a lot. You know, we got ground attacks fairly frequently. The first 3 days I was there, we had one mortar attack that was so close you could hear the mortars coming out of the tubes. We had a sapper attack where we got up the next morning and found a bunch of North Vietnamese in the wire, you know, dead. And a rocket attack, which was just sort of more harassment than anything else. And during that period of time, there was a special forces camp that was in the process of being overrun, or the North Vietnamese were trying to do so, and we moved up to Dak To, which is further up near the area where the Cambodian, the Lao, and the Vietnamese border come together. And the living conditions up there were horrible. I was living with the Army, sleeping on a stretcher in a bunker, which was 110 degrees, and it was just basically horrible. But we did that.
What about your messing facilities? What kind of food did you have?
Again, it sort of varied. Pleiku was not too bad. I still can't stand the thought of reconstituted eggs. Or Kool-Aid. Because they, you know, you had Kool-Aid because that's what they put. And because who wanted to drink water that was so heavily chlorinated that you couldn't stand the smell of it? So water was Kool-Aid, and it was awful. And you had sea rations and stuff like that when you're out in the field. It wasn't too bad, but I'm pretty unparticular when it comes to food anyway. I went to a boarding school. Institutional food's fine with me, thank you very much.
At Pleiku, do you live in like a building with a hard?
Long hut kind of thing with rooms on either side, and kind of at one point there were sandbags, and they made a big double brick wall there to protect you from the possible hits and stuff like that.
You mentioned hut. Was it a Quonset hut?
No, it was similar to one. It was a Quonset hut, but it didn't have the rounded roof. It just had a regular peaked roof.
And you flew out of there to do your
job.
Okay. Every
morning, every day, whatever.
And then you mentioned you moved over with the Army closer to the Laos, Cambodia, Vietnamese border. Was it just tents that were set up, or were they hard?
No, it was a bunker. It was a hardened bunker. It was just sandbags. Is what it was. It was a sandbag, and I remember it had, you know, for example, the way they make bunkers is they just make a whole bunch of sandbags, and then they put little compartments and stuff like that, and they put sandbags on the top, and then they built a small section on top of that with more sandbags, because when a mortar or a rocket hits it, it takes out the top one, not the bottom one. It's just sort of a false roof, you might say. And of course, there are a lot of radio equipment in it, so the radio equipment generates a lot of heat. Not that it wasn't hot enough in Vietnam. This was like going into a sauna, a hot sauna.
When you moved locations, when did the move take place?
Well, we were in and out of Dak To. I was still based at Pleiku, but because of radio facilities and stuff like that, we were up there for a couple of months, probably end of May, June, and July of 1969. When you look at some of the books on Vietnam, you'll see the special forces camp called Ben Het. And Ben Het was what was under siege at the time, and it was during that period of time. There's some really neat pictures that were taken out of my airplane that I've seen periodically that have shown up places like that. The photographer spent 98% of his time throwing up and 2% of his time taking pictures, and to give him a great deal of credit, he did a great job taking pictures.
For the 2% of the time.
For the 2% of the time.
How much time did you spend there?
I got there in, I would say probably March of 1969, and I was there through August, until August. March, April, May, June, July, it was about 6 or 7 months.
From August of 69 until you came home in April of 1970, what did you do?
That's the story the Raven book is all about.
Once again, you got to keep in mind who we're talking about. Would you want to introduce the book and talk about that a little bit, as far as...
There was a program, the war in Southeast Asia, for those of your students who do not understand this, one of the most critical things and the most misunderstood thing is, well, the war in Vietnam. But Vietnam is not Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia is not Vietnam. If you look at the writing, the alphabet, and the language of the Vietnamese people, North and South, it's virtually the same, essentially. So, from a political point of view, you can argue, many people do, that the war in Vietnam we had no business being in. It was virtually a civil war. Also part of Indochina, early French Indochina, was Cambodia, Thailand, which was really not part of Indochina, and Laos. Well, those countries are ethnically the same, but ethnically different from the Vietnamese. Their writing is different. If you and I took off today and went to Canada and never told anyone that we were not Canadians, we would probably fit in just fine. If a Lao went to Cambodia or Thailand, he might be recognized as you and I might be by a change in accent, but for the most part that'd be the same. However, if you and I decided we wanted to go to a small village in Mexico, it'd be instantly obvious that we were not Mexican. Well, the same thing holds true in Vietnam, and there's a great deal of difference there. The Vietnamese had virtually invaded parts of Laos, part of it to run the Ho Chi Minh Trail, their supply line down into Vietnam, part of it because they just wanted the country, they just wanted what the country had to offer. In addition, the Chinese were building a road, and I don't mean a small road, I mean a big road, from China to Thailand, for reasons that I suppose you'd have to ask the Chinese. In 1961, before the war in Vietnam got started, there was a superpower confrontation when Kennedy was president over the country of Laos. And they had a Geneva Agreement, and the agreement virtually said that all foreign forces would withdraw from Laos. We did, temporarily. There were Russians there, and Poles, and Czechs, and Indians, and lots of other people there. Because of what was going on in Vietnam later, we decided that we needed to be there, rather than just say, hey guys, we're going back in, because after all, we're not the only foreign power in there. We put on this little show of neutrality and said, well, we won't send any military people there. So they took some military people if they needed to go there, and they sheep-dipped us, which basically means stripped us of all our military identification, asked for volunteers, and we went up there and we flew unmarked airplanes in civilian clothes.
So you were flying in Laos?
And I was flying in Laos. Not only was I flying in Laos and over Laos, as a lot of people did that were based in Thailand and Vietnam, but I lived in Laos. I lived in a little CIA base north of Vientiane, a place called Long Chinh, which was probably the most secret city on earth in 1969. It's a big place, relatively speaking, with no roads in and no roads out, but there were a lot of airplanes in and out of there. And our whole job was to stem the tide of the North Vietnamese advance through Laos, which we did.
We were there as, Americans were there as guests of the Laos government?
You bet.
For the standard reader of what was going on in Vietnam, but as you explained, it wasn't Vietnam, it was Southeast Asia or Indochina, there's very little mention of what was going on other than Vietnam. Why do you think that happened?
A number of reasons. For one, we tried to keep it a secret. Interestingly enough, the fact that there were some military men, military fighter pilots flying unmarked airplanes in Laos was not a secret to the North Vietnamese, as we were dropping bombs on their heads all the time. It was not a secret to the Chinese or the Russians. It really wasn't much of a secret from the Vietnamese. It was a secret from the American people. Because for one reason or another, we wanted to at least have the pretense of neutrality as far as Laos. And of course, toward the end, everyone was worried that everything was going to become another Vietnam. And we heard that the Persian Gulf is just going to be another Vietnam. Gee, there's a stick-up down at the local 7-Eleven. Well, do you think it'll be another Vietnam? I mean, everything is based on that. And it was toward the end there. What we found out was that we were incredibly effective. And the reason we were incredibly effective was we were not hampered by any of the rules and regulations that were going on in Vietnam by virtue of the fact that nobody knew who we worked for. We weren't even sure who we worked for. We really didn't care either. So, but the thing that's important, I think, to remember is that we were there at the behest of the local people. They were very happy to have us there because what they wanted was to get the North Vietnamese out of their country.
How were you, April of 1969, how were you selected to be one of the pilots later called the Raven? Well, not later called, it was called Raven before then, but for you.
It was August of 69, and what had happened was, as I explained earlier, there was a lot of stuff going on around Ben Het, and there were very few rear echelon types whom I hated, and most other warrior-type people that were out there hated. And you can read the book to find out what the rest of the rear echelon types are.
I know. I was strategic intelligence for 4 years. Right. My husband is an infantryman. He used to call me a ramp all the time.
Right.
But as my sister was reading the book yesterday in the car, she said, REMF. And she said, what's that stand for? And I told her, and she just laughed. She said, well, how do you know? And I said, well, because I was one for 4 years, and I got called that all the time.
Well, we hated those people because they were on our case all the time when they were around. So when we were getting mortared and rocketed at Pleiku, you couldn't find any REMs anywhere. They were gone. About July we chased the North Vietnamese back into Cambodia, which at that time was a sanctuary. So rules of engagement, sorry guys, can't go after them. They've, you've managed to save the camp at Ben Head, isn't that wonderful? And, lost a few people in the process, but the North Vietnamese are gone there on the other side of the fence, the other side of the border, so just leave them alone. All of the remps came up out of Saigon like a horde of locusts because they wanted to see where everything had happened. They didn't want to be there when it was happening, they just wanted to say that they had been there. And they started making up all sorts of useless little regulations and all sorts of idiot things. Wear your shirt on the flight line, and, I almost punched a major out one time when he told me a friend of mine had gotten a Silver Star, should have been court-martialed because he was endangering American lives and property and all that. And I said, well, give me a break. If you're not going to be out here and fight, then why don't you just go home? And they're all there getting their tickets punched, too. Don't make a military career, you got to be in Vietnam, and you might as well be a Pleiku, say you were a Pleiku, because that's where the battle was. But we're not going to say it was, we're just going to say we were there. So, I had about all of that I could stand. And a friend of mine who'd gone over to the program wrote me and said, things aren't so bad over here and there are no remps. So the way I got involved in it, interestingly enough, was I had a battle-damaged airplane, which the rule was if you got the airplane shot up, you had to take it down to get it fixed. So we patched up this airplane. I took it down to the Trang, which was our headquarters on the coast down there. And this lieutenant, as I walked in the office, said, well, it looks like they've killed all the O-1 drivers. That's the airplane that we ultimately ended up flying, and you had to be an O-1 pilot to get in. And I said, how's that? He said, well, now they're taking O-2 pilots, which is what I was. So I said, Lieutenant, I volunteered. He thought I was kidding, of course. I said, I'm not kidding. But I had to fight to get into the program because I was, at the time, the only combat tactics instructor pilot at Pleiku in the O2. So my boss didn't want me to go. So I figured, fine, what are they going to do, give me orders to send me to Vietnam? I mean, I'm already here. So I went over his head. I wrote myself orders because I was the detachment commander. I went to Saigon, and I found a colonel down there who said, oh, yeah, we'd like, stable type. You are a stable type, aren't you? And I went, yes, sir, I sure am. So we got enough cowboys up there in that program. Do you know anything about it? No, sir, I don't. So, well, I don't either, because it was very, very secret. I just signed up and went. Got my training out of the way and just took off.
What training did you have to go through?
I had to get checked out on the L-19 tail dragger, an O-1, small airplane, which wasn't too difficult, and get so many hours. So I did all of that at a little base in the middle of the jungle someplace. And having gotten that, I went over to Laos.
So you got there in August of
August
69?
of 69, right.
Just as a point of reference, the O-2 is what the plane that Danny Glover flew in Bat-21?
That is correct.
And the O-2 is what, how many people were flying that other than the Ravens? Was that a common aircraft?
No, the O-2 was not flown by the Ravens. The O-2 was
right, I know, but how, the O-2 was common for the forward air controllers in Vietnam.
Yes.
Where was the O-1 being used? Only by the Ravens?
By the Ravens, and it had been used in Vietnam for some time. And I don't know if there were many O-1s left in Vietnam by that time. They were being slowly, as they were shot down or destroyed or whatever, they were being replaced by the O-2 or the OV-10, which was the next version of another airplane. So they just kept upgrading the material.
I worked with the OV-10. It was actually the OV-1D when I worked with it. I was in Army RTC. They had something called Cadet Troop Leadership Training, and I did that with the Mohawks at Fort Hood, Texas.
Okay, now the OV-1A, that's different. That's an Army airplane. The OV-1 and the OV-10 are different. The OV-10 is basically the same idea. It's a twin-engine turboprop airplane, but it's basically a forward air controller airplane, and it's front and back, has a boom tail on it. It looks different. You'll see the difference.
Okay. So when you were, okay, then let's skip to August of 69. I'm not skip to it, but let you pick up from there.
Okay.
What were your first impressions of what was going on and how you fit in when you first arrived? And what were the living conditions like then?
The living conditions were good. It was a very strange transition because remember that it was very secret. So the first thing you did is in your military uniforms, you went to Udon, Thailand, the base there, Udon, and you turned in all your uniforms, took off your flight suit, gave them your dog tags, gave them your ID. And for a while, until you got up to Laos, you had no ID, which was kind of strange because how do you get around if you don't have any idea? I mean, who are you? And the guy who briefed me was sort of interesting because he was, some of these things I would not have remembered quite as well for as long if Chris had written this book because we brought all this sort of stuff up. But this guy was great. He just sort of said, well, you're going up country, and he didn't say what country. And I had a pretty good idea because I'd known some people that were involved in all of this. And I met one of the guys that I was to fly with, a friend of mine that had been in Vietnam. And the way you he just said, come out tomorrow morning, get on an airplane. A little bitty Air America shack. A lot of probably your class may have seen Air America, whatever. Air America was the largest airline in the free world. The only airline in the world that was larger than Air America in 1970 was Aeroflot, virtually the number of airplanes. But, I mean, they were everywhere, but it was a CIA proprietary, so nobody knew anything about it. And of course, all our airplanes were little, most of them were. So I just came out there the next day, and a C-123 K model with the big jets and the the big props and 2 jets, just got on it and off we went. Got processed in up there and was given an ID card, which basically said I worked for the embassy. And that's all it said. I had my own little cover story about working for USAID and working in the forestry department and all this sort of stuff, none of which anybody believed, but just in case. And I ended up going from there up to Longchen, which was the CIA base up there, and just went up there and started putting in airstrikes, which was something that I certainly knew how to do from having been in Vietnam. In order to get into the program, in order to be selected for the program, you had to have a couple of requirements. You had to be a fighter pilot, you had to have 6 months in country in Vietnam, and they wanted it for a while to have tail dragger time, but then for one reason or another they decided they'd train a bunch of us in L-19s if we hadn't flown them.
Why did they want someone with fighter pilot experience since you weren't, okay, let me go back. Would you explain the mission, your mission when you were there?
The mission that I was essentially the same mission as the one that I had in Vietnam. The reason that I was in Laos, living in Laos, was because you simply could not live in Thailand and fly that far away and conduct a day's worth of putting in strikes and all that and have enough fuel to get back. So it was much easier to just have us live out there in the woods, so to speak. So, but our job was to direct airstrikes on the North Vietnamese positions in Laos. Then the airplanes came to strikes that we control were usually from Thailand, some from Vietnam, depending on some of the Ravens that were over there in the panhandle of Laos. We working with guys from Da Nang and places like that. Most of the places that I worked, I had airplanes that came up from Thailand.
Why did they want people with fighter pilot experience then, since you were a forward air controller?
Because you need to know what the fighter pilot's doing. You've got to. They sent you to ground school. This was at the Air Commando School before I even went to Vietnam as a forward air controller, to learn the difference between a platoon, a battalion, a regiment, a brigade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I didn't know any of that sort of stuff, and how the Army operates, because you had to operate with the Army. But since you're dealing with the Army or some ground troops who are fighting against some other ground troops, you really need to be able to talk to a fighter pilot, and you need to know what he's doing. And when you look up there and see him do something, you've got to be able to put yourself in his place. So having fighter experience was invaluable. I mean, anybody could do it. Anybody could go out there and say, well, here's a target and I'll put my smoke on it. But it makes a big difference if you know what kind of speeds he's operating at, what kind of angles he's operating at, and so on and so forth, so you can stay out of his way.
With the fighter pilots that came and attacked the targets that you marked, where were they flying out of?
Most of them were flying out of Thailand. Udorn, Ubon, Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, Karat, Tok Lee, those were the big bases there in Thailand.
You knew that you were undercover, you lived in Laos. What were those fighter pilots told, about their mission, since they were also flying in Laos, but they were living there?
I don't know what they were told exactly. They were told, you take off, you hit a tanker, get some gas, you head up to a certain radio off a certain radio station, and you contact a Raven on this frequency. As far as he knew, we were just a voice. He knew we lived up there, but it was pretty secret. And some of the fighter pilots said that they used to laugh about that. And occasionally we'd show up down at some of their bases, and they could always tell the Ravens because we didn't have any uniforms, for one thing. Secondly, our hair was about 2.5 times longer than it's supposed to have been. And remember, this was 1970, 1969, 1970, when long hair was definitely out, so to speak, or there was the military, the short haircut. So anything that went over your ears, as long as that, everybody. So, and we had long handlebar mustaches and long sideburns and stuff like that. And you come strolling on the base, and the colonels would be jumping all over you, and you just tell the colonels to go fly a kite.
This was the base you're talking about when you went back to Thailand?
Yeah. I mean, you go down to Udon and just drive them crazy because they didn't know who you worked for, and they didn't have any control over you, which the military really likes, who works for whom, and if you're a lieutenant, then you salute all captains, right? Hey, what were we? They didn't know, and we weren't about to tell them. And most of them had enough of the rear echelon types anyway, So, you know, it was great fun. Like, let's go down and bait a few kernels. Oh, okay, that's a good idea.
In the 8 months that you were in Laos, how often did you get out of Laos to go to Thailand or other places?
We were supposed to get 4 days off a month to go anywhere we wanted. And that's probably about close to right. Sometimes we didn't get any time off. It depended on what the war was doing. You know, there were times when, I mean, you flew 2 or 3 times a day sometimes, frequently.
So you would fly out of your base and then come back to refuel or get new mission assignments and then go back out?
Or you would sometimes, very more frequently than that, when we owned the Plain of Jars up there, you'd take off from Longchen and you'd fly out and put a mission in and you'd land on the Plain of Jars because there was a fuel depot there on this little strip that was just PSP, and just land on this little metal temporary strip and get some gas and some rockets and just keep going. You can fly 2 or 3, you can fly 3 missions a day easily. When Longchen got overrun, I was flying the T-28, which is a prop fighter it was a trainer that they'd made a fighter out of, and we were flying 3 missions on 1 tank of gas because the enemy was so close that we would take off and literally pull up into a Chandelle and drop most of our ordnance on the backside of a ridge that couldn't have been more than 2 miles, 3 miles away, and then come back in and land and re-up, put more bombs and stuff like that, and take off again. It was usually the 3rd mission before we had to stop for gas.
Wow. Would you like to stop and get some coffee?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, just wanted to check. Did you have any time in the days that you had off, or any time during the years that you were over in Southeast Asia, that you went to any of the Armed Forces Rec Centers there? Did you have availability to those?
Never went to one.
And after you left flying C-141s, did you come back to the States at any time?
When I left the 141 program, I think I finished up there in December of '68. And I went to the Air Commando School in Fort Walton Beach in like January, February, March of '69.
And then you came back and you stayed over till April of '70.
Right.
When you were back in the States, did you see any of the protesters other than what was going on in...
Not personally. I mean, I didn't actually observe any of that. I just saw what was going on TV.
On the news?
Right.
Did you see any news that contradicted what you knew what was going on, and how did you react to that? You weren't in the Ravens yet, but...
That's a hard question, because I don't recall seeing anything in the media at that point that I knew was contradictory to what I knew was going on. But I suppose if everybody in the country was divided into hawks and doves, I suppose I was fairly much a hawk by virtue of the insularity of my position in the military. But it was not so much whether I was for or against the war. I felt very strongly that some funny things have happened since you'd come back, and people would give you a hard time about going. And they'd say, why did you go? And my usual answer is, because you sent me. They'd go indignantly. They say, I didn't send you. I've been out there carrying signs. I said, wait a minute, you vote, don't you? I said, you know, the government sent me, and you are the government. And on balance, I really don't have an objection to people protesting. If somebody wanted to know why I went to Vietnam, it's so that people could protest. I mean, that's just the way the system operates. It's not a perfect system, but it works pretty well. I have a real problem with people like Jane Fonda, who went to North Vietnam, sat on an anti-aircraft gun, called the POWs liars, racists, and hypocrites. Look it up, that's on tape. And then came back home. You know, I think, okay, fine, lady, you can just stay over there. And she and Ramsey Clark are the 2 people that, as far as I'm concerned, should not have United States citizenship. The rest of them, hey, if they have a war, whether it's in the Persian Gulf or whether it's in Vietnam or wherever it happens to be, and you want to go to Canada, go. And that's your right, but don't come back. Say, oh well, war's over, now come home, get a good job. I mean, there's a certain amount of responsibility. You owe something to the country, this country in particular, for living here, for the ability to live the way we do. The country's not always right. It's not always going to be right. But you can't just pick and choose. Each person can't be their own government and say, well, I don't vote because I don't like the government, and I don't like what they're doing today, and I'm out of here. But I'll be back tomorrow if things appear to be better. And that's just sort of the way I felt then. I still feel that way. So I really didn't have I may have disagreed with the protesters, and I might have argued with them, as I did on occasion when I got back. But I certainly would never have said that they don't have the right to do that.
Did you see, with the people you work with, the group before you got in with the Ravens, the other fighter pilots and other pilots when you were in Vietnam, did they have pretty much the same attitude that you did?
I think so. One of the individuals that I have kept up with, Jerry Grevin, was, he voted for George McGovern. He was about as far left as you could get without falling off the planet. And we used to argue politically, because I've been into history and political science for years, and I'm interested in that sort of thing. And Jerry was a great fighter pilot. Yeah, he was able to compartmentalize, to separate what he thought the country should be doing and what he thought he should be doing. Most of the other guys, I think, felt pretty much the way I did.
Skipping out to when you returned to the States for a moment. You flew in Laos. I'm sure you knew of lots of other people that were in Cambodia and Laos, but the government was still saying we weren't involved there. How did you feel about that? That what you were doing, and it wasn't just you. You had fighter pilots that were coming here from Thailand. The combat helicopter pilot that I interviewed earlier that was based in Vietnam and flew missions into Cambodia. What did you feel about that kind of government saying we're not there, and you knew that there were lots of people that were participating there?
Well, there are two ways of looking at this, and Jerry and I, that I alluded to a minute ago, used to argue this. Jerry's point of view was, if you level with the American people, they'll support us because what we're doing is honorable. Well, the other is, no, they won't, not in the way the world is right now in the United States. They're against most anything, and all you're going to do is create a firestorm that's going to create more problems than it will solve. Essentially, I wasn't happy with believing that. I didn't like that to be true, but that's what I thought. Every time anything happened in the States, there was this huge firestorm. I mean, the idea of going into Cambodia to try to clean out the Cosman was a good idea, but it caused Kent State. So, you know, why throw gasoline on a fire if you can help it? And subsequent to my involvement in Southeast Asia, looking at some of the records, what the Ravens managed to accomplish with as few people as they did is really remarkable. And again, it has to do with the fact that there weren't that many regulations and we were allowed to do what we needed to do to get the job done. Which, to digress for just a moment, is when Colin Powell and Schwarzkopf were working out the plans for what turned out to be Desert Storm, but at the time was Desert Shield. They apparently both went to the president and said, if in fact we have to go to war, that's our job. Your job is to decide what the objectives are and whether or not we go. However, if this war becomes micromanaged, as did the war in Southeast Asia, we'll quit. And you can deal with the political heat from that. And that's basically what the problem is. I mean, you train a guy to be a fighter pilot, and you train him how to hit a particular target, then it's the political side that decides whether he should do that or not. Once that decision's been made, there should be no more decisions until such time as the objective is reached or not reached. Well, that didn't happen in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson made a statement and said, those boys up there can't bomb an outhouse without my specific okay. Every Thursday they had target briefings, and the target briefings were not in Udon or Karat, they were in the White House. He was the one that was deciding the targets that were going to be hit. Well, unless you're involved in the war and right there, you cannot do that. And then he kept saying, well, I'm trying to send Ho Chi Minh a message. You don't send Ho Chi Minh a message by taking the absolute best and brightest and sharpest young man you've got in multi-million-dollar airplanes, dropping 500-pound hard bombs on small targets in North Vietnam. The only message that was sent, that was received, was the Christmas bombing in 1972. And it's interesting to note what the POWs had to say about that. When the B-52 showed up over Hanoi in Christmas of 1972, and of course by this time the country was absolutely coming apart at the seams when that happened, POWs rejoiced because they knew they were going home, because somebody finally was going to send a message that would be received, i.e. we're in for a dime, in for a dollar, we're going to continue this until you sit down at the peace table and you get those guys and send them home.
Keep going off on things after the war because we're already started that way.
Yeah,
and I'll go back to what was going on with you from August of 69 till April 70. But do you think that was one of the biggest things the American public had to deal with, was not having a clear-cut military go do their job, and that the military kept being held back by the politicians? Do you think that was one of the hardest things for Americans to deal with?
I think it was very difficult because nobody knew what the objectives were. No one knew what we were trying to accomplish in Vietnam, save for the status quo. And the military was hampered significantly by rules of engagement that were incredibly complex and very difficult to follow. Harry Summers wrote a great book called On Strategy. You read it?
Yes, I have.
Well, you know the beginning when it says, he talks about the North Vietnamese colonel and the American, or the North Vietnamese general and the American colonel in Hanoi, and the American talks to the North Vietnamese and says, you know, you never once defeated us on the battlefield. And the North Vietnamese general thought about that for a minute and said, you're correct, and that's also irrelevant.
Right.
Good lesson. It was irrelevant. Tet of 68 totally wiped out the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were never a fighting force after that. It was strictly the North Vietnamese army and the Americans. And yet it was a tremendous defeat, psychologically and politically, because of all the lying that had gone on about how the light at the end of the tunnel and so on and so forth. Did you read The Best and the Brightest?
No.
David Halberstam's book, won a Pulitzer Prize.
I have seen it, but I haven't read it.
I mean, it talks about, the lieutenant was telling the captain what the captain wanted to hear, he was telling the major what the major wanted to hear, but by the time I got to the White House, and they were doing this body count business. That's a silly-ass way to run a war. If you really total up all of the body counts that we say we killed, shit, we killed every man, woman, and child in North Vietnam at least twice. It was just ridiculously mismanaged. The Army had its share, the Air Force had its share, the politicians had its share. Everyone complains and they say, oh, gee, the media really undermined the American and so on and so forth. They did. They had their share too. But that wasn't the only part of it. There just wasn't a clear-cut objective. And you need one. I mean, there were some other mistakes. I was so gratified to see that Bush went to the Congress to find out whether the Congress would approve the use of force in the Persian Gulf. Now, my real question is, what would have happened had it gone against him? My own personal opinion is he should have just turned up his hands and say, okay, I'm the commander-in-chief. You said we can't use force. You got it. Every guy comes home right now. And if the Iraqis go through Saudi Arabia the day after tomorrow, that is not my problem. That is your problem. That is your decision. You said don't use force. If we can't use force, I'm bringing them home. But that's not what happened. So he got the Congress, and the Congress represents the country. So I think we should have done that. I think we should have gone to the Congress and said,
in 1964, 65?
Well, we did at the Gulf of Tonkin.
Right.
But I think there should have been some sort of declaration, and in that declaration, whether it's a declaration of war or not, a resolution, there should be some clear understanding of what the objectives were. These are what the objectives are, and we will do anything we need to, up to, but not including, the use of nuclear power, to accomplish that. And the very next day, they should have airplanes up there mining the harbor in Haiphong. Next day. Because, I mean, the French and the Germans and the British were all trading with North Vietnam the entire time. Why not? There wasn't a declaration of war.
That's for Vietnam. What about our involvement in Laos?
In Laos, had we done that, then, of course, the idea, the way to cut down a tree is not to trim the leaves one at a time, you go after the roots. If we had done that, the North Vietnamese would have been forced to withdraw. The North Vietnamese now occupy a good part of Laos, even though they say they do not. They are slowly withdrawing. The reason they're withdrawing is economics. They simply don't have the money anymore. Their economy's on its butt. And there are some small forces up there that are chipping away, again, indigenous forces, mountain tribes people that don't want the Vietnamese there now any more than they did 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And they're just being forced to withdraw for economic reasons.
So you think if we would have gone full force after North Vietnam, we wouldn't have had the problems that we had in the rest of Indochina?
Absolutely. Had we said, look, guys, and we made it perfectly clear. It's interesting because during the election of 1964, when Goldwater ran against Johnson, and they had all these wild campaigns of Goldwater's going to blow up the world and so on and so forth, and Lyndon Johnson said that he wanted Asian boys to fight Asian wars. He got elected. Took office in January. In February, we started bombing North Vietnam. Interesting. Goldwater just said it outright. But there's a psychological difference. With Goldwater, you would have known. I mean, you know, when Ronnie said he's going to do something, he just basically did it. So there were lots of times, I think, when the North Vietnamese were really on the ropes, but they kept thinking, gee, if we can just hold on long enough, the Americans will get tired of fighting the war. And they did, and we did.
Okay, now I've digressed too much, so I'll go back to
Press on.
August of '69. You said you were in Laos and you lived in Laos. You were at a CIA camp there, and the planes were based out of there, and sometimes you got to go back down to Thailand. What kind of facilities were there at the camp that you were at?
They were pretty good. We lived in a concrete bunker house, and for a while we had a cook, and then we had to cook for ourselves, and then we hired a Thai cook, and it wasn't too bad. We more or less took care of ourselves is what it came down to. And it was pretty good. I don't have any real complaints about that.
Did you have telephones available to call home?
Mm-hmm.
Did you have mail service going in and out to get mail from home?
Yes and no. We had mail. Our address, again, since we were all civilians, instead of being Captain Morrison, I was Mr. Morrison, and a box number and an APO. And that mail showed up somewhere in Thailand, I believe, and was collected there, put in a diplomatic pouch, and brought to Laos. So it probably took a bit longer to get the mail up there than it would have had I been in Thailand or Vietnam or someplace like that.
Did your family and your wife, did they feel that was weird, and what did they ask you about, or?
They thought I was crazy, but, so what else is new? They thought it was, strange that all my uniforms showed up, and...
They mailed them back to them?
Yeah, and they just sort of said, oh, that's interesting, and they weren't quite sure what I was doing, and I wasn't about to enlighten them too much. I just said that I was up there doing some different sort of work and different sort of flying, and it was okay, not to worry.
What did you tell them that you were at?
I don't know that I told them anything. I just said that, I've been working in and out of Thailand, which was true, and that was about enough, I think.
The supplies, did you get all your supplies pretty much through Thailand?
Yeah, everything came by Air America. Air America delivered everything.
Okay. And so did you have mostly, you said you had a Thai cook after a while, but the first cook you had, was that an American military?
We stole a cook. We went to NKP and we found a guy who was really a great cook and all that. Actually, this was before I got up there, and a guy named P.F. Ronnie Reinhardt, who's well mentioned in the Raven book, decided that he liked this guy, SB, so he just put him in the airplane and took him. Well, Laos was like a black hole. And once you got up there, they could hoot and holler, but what are they going to do? They're not allowed there in uniform, and they don't know exactly where we are, so we just took him. Well, his time expired, and he was going to go home, so when he left, they didn't want to give us a cook to begin with, let alone another one. So we rooted around for a while. For a while, we cooked for ourselves, which was, I don't know, some guys say it was a disaster, but I think it worked all right. And it was kind of tough, though. You got mechanics that are out there, trying to keep airplanes together, and then they come in at night to cook. I mean, it was difficult, time-wise. And then after a while, we said, well, this is silly, so we went and hired 2 Thais to come up and cook. But then the North Vietnamese got kind of close, and every once in a while, we'd get a couple of incoming rounds, and they disappeared.
Did you have American-style food, or mostly indigenous foods?
As best we could, we had American-style food. That was where we ate right there. Every night we'd go down, and somebody would go down to General Vang Pao, who was the local indigenous leader down there, and we'd eat down there with him, and that was all strictly Lao food. And when you ate out in the woods, which I did for the second half of my tour up there after Long Chen got overrun, and I used to stop at these little out-of-the-way places with little bitty strips, and you just ate with the locals there. So I ate all the Thai food, or actually Lao food.
Okay, you already mentioned that you had a division in time because of locations and things like that, but for the first part of the time that you were with the Ravens, about how many people were up there? How many American pilots were there?
9.
And was it pretty a constant number?
Mm-hmm. There were 9 pilots at Long Chen. There were 22 American pilots in country, and to the best of my knowledge, 22 was about the maximum number of Raven pilots that were living in Laos at any one time.
So 22, were they divided up among 2 or 3? 5 different bases.
There was Vientiane, which was the administrative capital down on the Mekong River just north of Thailand. There was Long Chen, which was the largest base. Then Luang Prabang, which is further north yet, and that was the royal capital. And then there are 2 other towns, Savannakhet and Pak Se, which are down along the Panhandle, and we had some Ravens down there too.
You didn't fly by yourself?
Yes and no. Sometimes I flew by myself. Very frequently when I would have with me an observer in the back of the L-19, and he was both an observer and an interpreter. In Vietnam, you didn't need an interpreter because there were always Americans. Even if you were working with Vietnamese, there was always an American advisor. Here, there was very often not an American on the ground. Sometimes there were some more contract people that were former Green Berets who were working for the CIA, and they were on the ground, but quite often that wasn't the case. So these guys acted as observers and knew the country very well, and knew one of them saved my butt at least once when the weather got absolutely horrible. Got down in these very, very steep, sharp mountains with rain clouds, and every single top of every single mountain had a layer of clouds across it. So, you know, you didn't dare fly into the clouds because it may turn into a granite, piece of granite. And, you know, he would say, oh, over this valley, you know, turn left here. And by the time we got started trying to wend our way home, I hadn't the foggiest idea where we were. I'd been in country about probably 2 weeks. And, you know, he was very happy. I figured, well, if we hit something, he's going to die just as quick as I am. And he'd go this way, and he would go that way, and he'd go over that ridge, you know. And every time you go pop over a ridge, you're not sure quite what you're going to see. Boom, man, we just popped over the ridge, and I suddenly found the little town of Samtong, which was a short path away from where we live. I thought, oh, home.
Was this Laotian civilian?
No, they were Laotian military, Lao military.
From the government forces, the Ravens?
Right.
Okay. Right. And do they volunteer to work with the Ravens?
I don't know that, to tell you the truth. Probably. They probably did.
But they were all for Americans being there and very supportive of your mission?
Oh, yeah, very, very much so. What's interesting is because of what happened afterwards, the Laos would still like to get the Vietnamese out. This time they don't want any American support. Because what happened, in essence, was that we supported them and ultimately thereby escalated the war, which was escalated on the other side. And then we escalated it again to win, and they escalated. So essentially what was happening in Vietnam. And we escalated it again, and they escalated, and then we walked away. And you can imagine the difference in balance there, which was the real tragedy of what happened in Laos. The real tragedy of what happened in Laos is the fact that it is separate, that Henry Kissinger, bless his ever-loving heart, could have cared less about the Laos. And they were the best allies we had in Southeast Asia. The Hmong tribespeople up in northern Laos were easily the best allies we had, and we just sold them down the river for political reasons.
That's all back to us not acknowledging that we were in Laos?
I think by that time we'd more or less acknowledged that we were there, but when you read the Paris agreements and all that, you know, there were some adjuncts that had to do with Laos, and virtually what Kissinger said is, well, you know, you do whatever you want. Boom, walked away.
Okay, you said that about halfway through your time there that your location changed. What happened and where did you go?
We were overrun. The enemy just took the plain of jars, and then they bombed, mortared Longchen, so we just took off, and we ended up down at Vientiane. They ultimately did not occupy the place, but we ended up cycling in and out of there. We didn't spend the night there, but we would fly up there and refuel the way we had on the plain of jars, and we were able to keep them away from it, but at nighttime nobody was about to spend the night up there.
And where did you go after that?
Vientiane. I went down to Vientiane, which was the capital down there on the river, and we flew out of there.
And same mission?
Same mission.
And what was different about the two locations, other than the actual location change?
Well, Vientiane was a sleepy French Indo-Chinese town. It was really kind of nice. It was a colonial town, and it was lots of fun as far as that. The amenities were better there. It was a civilian town. You know, we got a little Jeep, and we had a little villa that we lived in. It was very strange because there were lots of vestiges from French Indochina, and when we moved, I moved in with this other guy, and we had this little villa, and we had a cook and a gardener and a maid, and it was like $90 a month each, $180 for the two of us. And the cook was he was Vietnamese, who had left Vietnam when the Vietnamese had taken over, the North Vietnamese. He decided rather than run to South Vietnam, he just took off to Laos. I mean, he was a French cook, and he was unbelievably good. And it was kind of strange because you'd have this wonderful meal at night, and then a, you know, well-served breakfast in the morning, and then you'd take your Jeep, run out to the airport, take off, and you'd be eating sea rations under a tent at noon. Fly a few missions and then come back.
Wherever you stopped.
You know, I would drink, I like rum and tonic, and I would come back absolutely totally dusty and dirty and you know, wounded maybe or whatever. Airplane just shot all to hell. Finally come dragging my buddy in there like that, go jump in the shower, and I'd come out of the shower, and there would be this big tall glass with rum and tonic in it. I go, this is the way to fight war. I love it. But it's kind of strange in a way, because then you unwind, you know, you have this French gourmet meal, but you've got to get up the next morning and drag your butt back out to the airplane and go do it all over again.
And you did that until April of 1970. Why, after spending so many years over in Southeast Asia, why did you come back then?
Time was up. You know, I would have to have had to extend for another 6 months. I thought seriously about working for Air America, but my wife at the time said, either you get your butt home or stay by yourself. I went, oh, okay, guess it's time to go home. And my son was very young at the time, and Air America would have brought them over, and I could have stayed for a couple more years, maybe made a few dollars and whatever. I'm not terribly regretful that I came home when I did. I mean, you never know what might have happened, but that's all right. I'd flown 446 combat missions. I had a little over 1,000 hours of combat time. You know, ended up with a Silver Star and a couple of DFCs and 14 air medals, and you know, that's enough. I was ready to get out of there. I think I was tired. There was a lot of strain and all that.
Raven stayed in that area until when?
Until the end of the war, 73. Our involvement in the war.
Did their mission, do they continue on doing the same thing you
Correct.
were doing the whole time
Yes.
until they left in 73? When you came back to the States, what did you do?
Worked very briefly for my father-in-law, who promptly went out of business. Then I went to work for Procter & Gamble for a short period of time, which I hated, as the junior executive and whatever. And then I ended up working for Merrill Lynch as a stockbroker, which I enjoyed significantly more. I flew with the National Guard. I started off flying tankers with the National Guard, then I ended up flying fighters. I joined the National Guard unit that was closest to where I was living. The general up there pinned a bunch of medals on me and stuff like that. And I said, oh, this looks like fun. So I joined that. That base closed and moved up to Columbus, Ohio, and they had a fighter outfit up there. So I went immediately across the street and said, can I get into this outfit? And they said, sure. So I started doing that, and then got hired by Delta shortly thereafter. Well, 1972.
Why did you decide to get out of active duty?
Because they were going to send me back to Charleston, South Carolina, and fly C-141s.
And it just
And I didn't
wasn't
want
the
to do
thing.
that. I didn't want to do that. If they had given me another fighter assignment, I probably would have stayed. But they said, oh, no, you know, you've already flown 141s and we need 141 pilots. And I said, not this one, you don't. And the war was winding down. I'll give you an example of somebody else who did the same thing. He and I were in the same pilot training class. We had the same T-38 instructor. We were good friends for the whole time we were in the Air Force. But he had some enlisted time. He had 4 years enlisted time and then 4 years for the Airman's Education Commissioning Program. And he went back to Charleston to fly 141s. He was not a Raven, was not a forward air controller. He actually flung Caribous. He also had an engineering degree. And he volunteered for everything he could to get out of 141s. Finally ended up being a test pilot on the C-5. Then after that, when he did the lifting body, and then when they needed somebody to fly the 747 when they were doing the shuttle, he did that. He was John Young's deputy, and he ended up being a shuttle pilot.
Wow.
Unfortunately, his name's Dick Scobie, and he was killed when the Challenger blew up. But anyway, you know, he stayed in and decided he would stick it out because he only had so many more years to retire. I stayed with him before when I got home. When I got back, I went back through Charleston and just hung out with him, sitting around drinking beer until God knows what time, middle of the night. And he said, well, I got so many years in, I'm staying in. And I said, man, I am checking out of here. Because I didn't want to fly 141s. I was going to either go back to flying fighters or I was going to get out.
And that was the only option they gave you.
But the war was winding down, so they had enough pilots as it was. So they, you know, their deal was, hey, you know, we're not desperate for people. So I said, great.
And you are from Ohio, and you went back to
I
Ohio.
went back to Cincinnati.
And your family had stayed in Charleston the whole time that you
No,
were
they
there?
went back to Cincinnati also. We moved them up to Cincinnati, or we moved up to Cincinnati before I left. So my wife and son were in an apartment in Cincinnati. I moved back there. We got a house, and I went to all those before-mentioned jobs.
When she was in Cincinnati by herself before you came up to join her, did she have any problems with anybody when they found out that her husband was a pilot?
No, I don't think so. I think that she was, but I think she was ignored.
Really?
Which is as much a problem, but basically I think she was ignored. Nobody paid much attention to her. They were all into their own lives and so on and so forth, and no one, if there wasn't this awareness of the war, you know, oh, your husband's not here, where is he? Oh, he's in Southeast Asia. Oh, well, you know, that's sort of the end of it.
Out here on the deck.
Why did you decide, from when you got out and you stayed in the National Guard, you were flying in the National Guard until when?
Until I went to work for Delta, or shortly after I went to work for Delta. It was too much to commute. Do you need to run that?
No, I just need to look at this and tell me if you think it's very needs to be adjusted.
Okay. No, it's not-
You mentioned that you flew with the National Guard and you flew fighters in the National Guard. And how long did you do that?
I was in the Guard altogether for, I guess, 2 years, maybe a little longer.
So you had 7 years of military service.
Right.
Why did you get out of the Guard?
Family considerations. They didn't have a fighter outfit that I could get in down here, and
So you moved to Atlanta then?
so I moved to Atlanta when I went to work for Delta. My wife was giving me a hard time about being gone and all that, which, you know, I can relate to. That's probably very true, so I opted not to. Then they changed from F-100s, which is what I had been flying in Ohio, to F-105s, which is an airplane I'd always wanted to fly. And I wanted to get back into the Guard, and we got into another one of these family discussions, which I ultimately did what I was supposed to do, which was say, oh, okay, I won't do that, that's the one decision I sort of regret, because I would really like to have flown that airplane. But, whatever.
And you came down here and you worked for Delta?
Yeah.
This is something that I've read in the book, but if you will talk a little bit about what the Ravens have done to help. You mentioned earlier that after the escalation all over Southeast Asia, especially in Laos, and we just left the Laotians to do, and the government that we were backing left them to fend for themselves. But even after the last Raven mission, and they were involved even past the ground forces in Vietnam had already stopped. What role have the Ravens played in trying to help the Laotians since then?
We incorporated for obviously, you know, tax reasons or whatever, and we have been supporting refugees for the last 15 years. We took a family of 8 Lao refugees from Atlanta, north of Atlanta, and hold on a second. Can you? Skywalker.
What you do, what the Ravens have done?
And we supported a family of 8 refugees. We brought them here to Atlanta, and interestingly enough, people complain about, oh, we don't have enough jobs and we don't want any more refugees here in Atlanta. A family of 8, of which there was no father, because he had been captured and was taken to a re-education camp, i.e. concentration camp. So there was a mother, 3 older children, 3 younger children, and a granddaughter. The mother stayed home with the 3 younger children, and the 3 other children went out and worked. In 18 months, we had rented them a house, and we were more or less helping them get on their feet and all that. In 18 months, we were going to re-up the rent from the house, and they said no, they didn't want to. The reason they didn't is because they went out and bought themselves a $65,000 house.
Wow.
And they all 3 worked, and they're doing quite well. Thank you very much. And we've not spent a penny of the government's money, and we've done that a number of times. The people that we worked with, the Hmong tribes people of northern Laos, have a fair amount of trouble adapting to the United States because they are animists. They believe in spirits and all that sort of stuff. And they are, of all the people of Southeast Asia, probably the most, I don't want to use the word backward because that's judgmental, but the least modern, the least adapted to modern civilization. But they have something that stands them in good stead. They know how to work. And they'll take a job and work and take 40% of their money and put it away and live on the rest of it. And it doesn't take very long, regardless of whether you're working at McDonald's or the CEO of a big company. It really doesn't make much difference. If you take 40% of what you earn and put it away, it won't be long before you have some money.
Right.
And if you have 2 or 3 people in the family doing the same thing. We got 2 of them jobs, 2 young boys. One of the boys had swum across the river, got in a boat, come back to get his family. Been shot at on one trip. Put his entire family, his 18-year-old boy, put his entire family in this boat, taking them across the Mekong River to get out of Laos when the communists took over. Which will probably tell you a little bit about what it's like to live under the communist government. And communist is probably not a good word because that's a political delineation, but totalitarian would be just as well, or whatever, dictatorship. But anyhow, they're doing quite well, and the Hmong people work hard. Anyway, we got them jobs as bricklayers, and because of the malnutrition that they had for a long time, they had a hard time lifting the bricks and all that, which they quickly overcame. But the guy we got them the job with, who was also a Greek immigrant, and came back to me personally and said, I will take all these people you can possibly bring me. He said, they show up on time every day, and they work until you tell them not to. They never take a break until you say, take 10 minutes off. They're okay, then they take 10 minutes off. And the other day laborer type people that they have, you know, they don't show up on Fridays, or if they do, they leave early. And if they come to work on Monday morning at all, they're either drunk or hungover. And if you're in the business like that, and you have to say, I'll have this wall built or this chimney built by such and such a time, you have to depend on your laborers. So these people are great. They know how to work, and for that, of course, they get compensated, even if it's a fairly low hourly wage. And you've got 2 of them doing that, and then Kiamani, who was the girl, was working doing piecework on a sewing machine, and they lived quite well, all 8 of them. And we've done the same thing. We took some refugees and settled them in France because some of the people there spoke French and they wanted to go to France, so we got some over there. And as best we can, we've been able to sort of take care of some of them. Not enough.
And why do you do that with those? Because of the support they gave the Ravens?
Because they're good people. Because we, as the United States government, basically sold them down the river. I mean, we did things, what we did to the Hmong people in northern Laos, I wouldn't do to anybody. I really wouldn't. I wouldn't do to anybody. It was an incredible and a very much unknown travesty. Somewhere along the way there should be an accounting made of that. Because they died for us, for their own country too. And we just picked up and walked away. Part of it may have been because of the secrecy involved. We didn't have to make an accounting. And one of the other reasons that the war in Vietnam, or the war in Laos, was kept so secret for so long was that the press was always actively involved in Vietnam. So who wanted to get stationed to Vientiane? Plus, when everything was so hush-hush, there were a lot more stories going on in Vietnam. So because it was secret, maybe the government was able to play politics better because there was no press to watch over them and say, wait a minute, guys, what are you doing here?
But then also because it was so secret, they were able to walk away without having the uproar from the press that came after Vietnam.
That's right. But we walked away from Vietnam.
Right.
Too. We basically did the same thing. Big congressional debate, do we want to put any more money in Vietnam? And everyone said no. I don't know that that was a good or a bad decision. I can certainly understand why after 10 years of war over there, we certainly hadn't decided we wanted to win the war. So if you haven't decided you want to win the war, might as well cut out. You should have done it earlier.
And you do this to help the people because even though it's a small or may seem small or insignificant compared to the numbers of people that were affected, it's something that you can do and your group can do as people for them. The patch that you're wearing, that's the Ravens patch?
Yes.
And when you didn't have uniforms, so how did that evolve? Did that evolve out of the people after they left the Ravens and left Southeast Asia?
Yeah, we just designed it ourselves. You know, it evolved. There were several different patches. One of them was red and all of that, and it just seemed to be a pretty good. As I say, our group is the Edgar Allan Poe Literary Society because we incorporated in the state of Texas. And in the state of Texas, you cannot use the name Raven in any corporation because Sam Houston was called the Raven by the Cherokee Indians, which you may or may not know coming from Tennessee. And since he founded Texas, there is a state law that says there is no corporation in Texas called anything to do with Raven. So the guy who incorporated, who's a lawyer, who's a friend of mine, called me up and he told me this when we incorporated. I was the president. He said, "Okay, Prez, what are we going to call ourselves?" And I said, "H, I don't know. You decide. You're a lawyer." So that's what he decided. It's funny. You take money to the bank and, you know, from all over the world, different checks and all that sort of stuff. And it says Edgar Allan Poe Literary Society. When you get a new teller there, they look at you and they look at the checks and they go, "What is this all about?"
You guys keep in touch?
Oh yeah. We have a reunion once a year.
Three-letter identifier for Atlanta and Fulton County Airport.
Roger, stand by.
I'm sorry about that.
Of all the people that I've talked to so far in my interviews and other people that I've just talked to about Vietnam, very few of them keep in touch with people that they were involved with. Why do you guys keep in touch with each other?
I think there are a number of reasons. One, we're a small unit. One of the great tragedies of Vietnam is the men who went to fight the war went alone, and they came home alone. World War II, they went off with their unit, they came back with their unit. The war is bad enough as it is, but if you can go with a group and come back with the same group, you can decompress and all that, which happened during the Second World War and all that. There's some real severe psychological problems, I think, that came from that particular thing. So you might go to join a unit that was already there, and then you may know some of the people, you may not. And then when your time's up, you walk out. Platoon had the greatest scene in the world at the very end when this, you saw the movie, this black guy was getting ready to go and he jumped up on a helicopter. And you know, it's like your orders come and you're gone. It doesn't matter if it's the middle of a firefight, you're gone. But the big thing was the big lie, which was that I'm out of here. I'm going back to the world and everything's going to be just the way it was when I left. Right? Wrong. We probably did a great deal of service to one another psychologically by having reunions once a year, long before anybody knew what PTSD was. But the reason we did this is because somebody had a reunion a long time ago, and back in 1974, 73, I guess. 72 was the first reunion. They just got together at Randolph and had a great time, damn near tore the club down. And then in 73, we had one in Hurlburt and got thrown out of the Air Commando School. And I said, well, I'll do the next one, 74, what the heck? And I've been doing them ever since. So I probably had to get a master's degree in social work for all of this. But nonetheless, it was difficult to find the group, but since it was a small group, relatively small, 160 pilots for the entire time the war was going on, if that many, probably not quite that many, and because we took such reasonably horrendous losses, the survivors are real tight. And we've all made good friends with one another, even though there were some people, a great number of people that I never met until I went to a reunion. And there's a thread that is sort of, that I can't define, that runs through each and every one of us that would want us, that would prompt us to volunteer for a dangerous assignment in the middle of an unpopular war. I'm not exactly sure whether it was frustration with what was going on in Vietnam, or whether it was any number of things, you know. So we instantaneously make friends with one another. You know, we have our own personalities and differences and so on and so forth. It's probably been good for us, and it's a shame that this hasn't happened more often. It didn't happen more often.
Of all the guys that are still around that were part of the Ravens, is it almost exclusive that everyone participates in the reunions as much as they can?
There are some guys that never come. There's some guys that always come. You know, some guys just want to put it behind them, and that's okay. That's up to them. They get a videotape, or you know, they get a newsletter from me every so often. You know, if they keep up. Some guys just don't. They don't want them. It was a bad experience, or it was this, or it was that. Some guys show up every once in a while when they're really feeling like they need to hook up again with some of the guys that they were with them. So it's a personal thing.
And you say a newsletter from you. I'm taking it that you're still the president of the Edgar Allan Poe Literary Society.
Until I can find some other sucker that wants to do it, I probably will be for another 10 years. But anyway, it's well worth it.
Do you have, I mean, are there are Ravens who want to put it behind them who just want to forget about it?
Believe it or not. Yeah, there are a couple of them that just don't want to participate for whatever reason. You know? And it was a pretty horrendous experience. A lot of guys, frequently, or strangely enough, some people are like that, then they'll show up for one reunion, and then you can't drag them away for about 3 in a row.
Really?
Because they really, really need it. They really need to unload. And then they'll go away for a while, and then they come back. You know? And some guys come all the time. I probably wouldn't go to every reunion every year if I weren't the president. Because I used to take pictures and put them in a book, and I can't tell 82 from 86 from 87. I mean, you know, they all look the same. We're all in the same place. You know, there's slightly less hair on my head each year, a slightly grayer hair on somebody else, you know, but it's the same old drunken hootenanny.
Do you have the reunion in the same place every year?
Usually. We have had it at different places, but Randolph Air Force Base in Texas puts up with us, and we pay for the damages that we do, which are less and less as we get a little bit older. And all that. But we have done some, I mean, we just about took out a wall and hurt over it one time.
Oh, as I was reading the book yesterday, I said I read the first few chapters and the last few chapters. When I read the part about you sitting there and eating a glass, I thought,
oh yeah,
I don't know if I want to interview this guy.
Eating a glass?
Oh yeah, right. Well, everybody has to eat a wine glass once in a while. It gets everybody's attention. My son made me do that up in Tennessee. Went to college one time. Somebody dropped a glass, and he quickly ran over and picked up a piece of glass and said, "Here, Dad, dessert, dessert." And he kept ragging on me until I finally said, "Okay, kid, I'll eat the glass."
Is it a trick, or do you really eat it?
You really eat it. Listen, I'll tell you a funny story about that. Groth, who's on the cover of the hardback, we were all sitting at a bar one time in, I think, New Orleans. And it's one of these bars where you just sit along this bar, about 3 or 4 of us, and they have all the glasses up above, and they have all the little lights up there. And it was in the middle of the afternoon. You know, about 5 or 6 o'clock, they always dim the lights. But the lights were up bright. And he didn't like that, so he unscrewed one of the bulbs. And the bartender came by and said, "You can't do that, we'll dim the lights later." And he screwed it back in. And after he turned around and walked away, Groth just unscrewed it again. And the guy came back this time reasonably irate, and he said, "Look, if you're going to sit here and drink, you're going to leave the light bulb screwed in." And he screwed it back in. And Groth looked at him, looked at the light bulb, he unscrewed the thing entirely, put it in his mouth, and ate it. Then he put the little stem thing in the ashtray, and the guy looked at him, he looked at the light bulb up there, he looked at him again, he looked at the light bulb in there, he just shook his head and walked away.
He left the light bulb out, huh?
Left the light bulb out. Boy, it was a great sound.
Oh!
I never heard it. Just bam, it just popped, man. Glass went everywhere. It was cool.
Oh, Lord.
I thought he would have burned his tongue because the pop was hot.
Yeah, the flame was probably really...
But I also lit a cigar off this guy's chest one time, too.
I read that in the book, too.
I did that in New Orleans, and they're still talking about it. He went down and he just unzipped his, he said, and we knew, I don't know how it happened, but I was working for Delta and he came in. We'd done this before, and his wife complains when the two of us get together. She says, you two get together, Growth comes home smelling like somebody set him on fire. And he loves these great big cigars, so he had this great big cigar, and there were a bunch of other Delta pilots around, and he'd come in from flying. He flies A-10s with a guard down this. We had a flight suit on like this with that T-shirt on. And he's got this big old hairy chest, so he came in there and he said, I feel in the need of a cigar. And this was totally unplanned. And I said, oh, Growth, I feel in the need of a cigar too. So he whips out 2 cigars, right? And so I lit his cigar, and he says, I suppose you'd like me to light your cigar. And there were a whole bunch of people down. I says, yeah, I think I would. So he just unzips his thing, sets fire to his chest, and this fire, and I go, and light my cigar. And man, everybody in the place just, I mean, you could have heard a pin drop in this bar in New Orleans. Everybody, and then pretty soon people started talking and said, no, I saw it, I did see it, and just went back and forth. He just zipped up his flight suit, put his chest out, and he just went back to drinking.
That's style.
Everyone has their own little parlor tricks, right?
Yeah.
Ours are just a little bit off the wall.
You talk about that one in the book, and that was another one I read. I went, oh man, this is going to be an interesting interview, I can tell.
But he looks so normal.
Oh yes, of course, I am, most of the time.
Yeah. See, and all I can do is turn my eyelids inside out.
I can't think of any questions I haven't asked. We've talked about what got you involved in the military. We've talked about the different experiences that you had over there, or at least a little bit about generally what you're doing. Talk about you coming back home and what you did professionally when you came back home, and what you did personally as far as the Raven organization. Is there anything that you can think of with the parameters I told you about the object of the video that you can tell the students about the whole experience, and something that they need to learn, or what America should have learned from that for college-age students from the 1990s?
I think there are a few things that are important to touch upon that I've already touched upon. One is you shouldn't send a group to war singly. You shouldn't put them on airplanes to join the existing group. They should go as a group. They should come back as a group, regardless of whether the country's for or against the war. The American public should support the soldier. Soldiers have a funny lot. They're in desperate need when there's a Rudyard Kipling poem that's just wonderful about what happens to a soldier. Yeah, good idea. There's a wonderful poem by Rudyard Kipling about a soldier and how much they need him, but once the war's over, they don't want him to be around. I mean, there were talks about putting soldiers in camps when they came back from Vietnam. Serious governmental studies. Well, what are we going to do with these people? Because after all, we trained them to kill. We don't want them now. It's important to support the individual soldiers. It's important for them to go as a group. It's important for them to come back. But some of the experiences that I had when I came back, one of which is pointed out and alluded to in the book, I think, was when I was going through training in New York and Merrill Lynch. From Merrill Lynch, there were some people that woke me up in the middle of the night to go down to what I thought was a party, and one of the guys was married to a Canadian, and they were just wound up. They were just wound really tight around the axle, and they'd all been sitting around drinking wine or beer or whatever, and they wanted to jump somebody is what they wanted to do. So they got on my case about having been in there and being a baby killer and all that. Why did I go? And I'm really such a jerk for even having gone. And if it weren't for people like me, you would have peace and light for everyone and all this sort of crap. I made the mistake of trying to argue with them rationally. That was never going to work. But it was 11 or 12 o'clock at night, and I just woke up and put on a pair of pants and a shirt and wandered into this hotbed. And then they called me the fascist down the hall and basically ignored me. My experience from coming back from Vietnam was I was met with indifference at best and hostility at worst. And that's not really good for people who've been through what we went through. And it doesn't do the country any good. There's a great deal of difference with what's happening now with the Persian Gulf. I'm glad to see that. I was hearing something on public radio the other night about the bitterness that comes back to the Vietnam veterans, and I agree. This war, this ground war, and I'm not taking anything away from what these people went through, the stress that they went through waiting to go to war, but they were on the ground war for 100 hours. An American soldier who went to Vietnam as an infantryman spent more days in combat on average than an American soldier who was in the European theater of World War II. Nobody seems to understand. They say, well, that was 4 years long. Yeah, but they marched and then they fought, and they marched and they sat, and they marched and they sat. In Vietnam, Air Mobile, you got in a helicopter and you went to where the fight was. When the fight was over, they put you back, gave you a beer and a place to sleep, put you in a helicopter the next morning and sent you out to fight again.
Or the fight found you at your base camp.
Or the fight found you at your base camp. So there was a lot of heavy combat that went on in Vietnam. And it's not even, I mean, they keep talking about this post-traumatic stress disorder. You're not going to have much of that from the war in the Persian Gulf because there wasn't that much heavy fighting. But I'm glad that we're aware of it. If there's anything that you need, that I would like to tell the people, students of yours or mine or anyone else's, is that a war is not a great idea, ever. But to decry and denigrate the soldier is ridiculous. Because a real soldier, a warrior in the true sense of the word warrior, wants peace more than anybody. Anybody that's been to war wants peace. Anybody that's had anything to do with a war wants peace. So to assume that a warrior wants to go out there and kill people and have a great time and play Rambo is total 100% unadulterated bullshit. If you have to go, you have to go. Do it. It's a job. Do it. Suffer through as best you can. But the American people had better be the ones that send the soldier. And they better be willing to accept the soldier when he comes back home. If the American public's not willing to do both of those things, then just don't go. And let the chips fall where they may. Again, I think as I said earlier, if Bush had not gotten the approval from Congress, had I been the president, I said, fine. They're on their way home, folks. That's it. That's what the Congress, i.e. the government, has decreed, and we're out of here. And you can decide, Congress, when Saddam Hussein does whatever he is going to do, how much of it. And of course, they immediately jumped on the presidential bandwagon. They love Bush now. They're going to try to make some political hay out of it. But if the ground war had gone against him, they'd have been down his throat in a heartbeat. They'd be out with their big knives. So, there were some lessons learned. Another thing that I heard Schwarzkopf say the other day that I thought was really great, they were talking about, isn't this wonderful, and we have this wonderful homecoming for all these American heroes and so on and so forth, and won't that erase the scars from Vietnam? He had 2 tours of Vietnam. He said, no. He said, a scar is a scar. And you have an operation, or you cut your arm and you have a scar, it's there. It's going to stay there. So we have to realize that. It may ameliorate to some extent the national trauma about Vietnam, but it's a scar.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
So, whatever.
It's real hard
The people that you were
See where
with,
you
and I've
finally
asked this
end up.
before, but just to something in the
Not too
summary
bad,
part,
just to hear
the people
that
you were
one
with,
maybe.
you
I don't know, you didn't.
supported
Okay,
the
you looked
soldier,
around
supported
there.
the military, but wish you would have had 100% backing for the military to do its job.
Yeah.
And you say your attitude has remained that since Vietnam without warfare. And most of the people in the Ravens felt the same way.
As far as I can determine, for sure.
But you had more autonomy than probably almost any other group that was
That's
there.
correct. That is correct.
Do you think that some of your feelings would be different than people that were in Vietnam since they didn't have that freedom?
Well, yes and no. The reason I ended up going to Laos was because of the lack of control and what was going on in Vietnam. So one led to the other. So the feeling was still there. And because of the problems that I had in Vietnam, that led me to go to Laos to get away from that.
So you felt that frustration for your first
You bet.
year and a half that you were there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's incredible frustration. You think, well, why am I here? Are we fighting a war or aren't we? And that in itself is not so bad. Okay, fine, you can be frustrated over that, but when someone gets killed, you start to wonder why. It doesn't make sense. Nobody likes to lose anybody, but when you start to lose somebody and you start to have casualties based on some sort of amorphous idea of victory, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. Again, if you're there to maintain the status quo, then inform everybody, inform the world, inform the American people, and say this is why we're here, this is the decision that we've made, and we're in for a dime, in for a dollar. And the war would have been over so much sooner, with so many fewer lives lost on both sides. Had we sent the B-52s over Hanoi, had we mined the harbor at Haiphong in 1966, I probably never would have set foot in Vietnam.
And some of your frustrations left because you were able to do a mission in Laos?
So my first,
About not being held back militarily?
Yes, perhaps because I can certainly say that I was given as much freedom as anyone could be given to do what I thought was an honorable job, which I did to the best of my ability, as all the Ravens did. And I don't have any apologies to make to anybody for having done that. But I really don't have any apologies to make for having done what I did in Vietnam either, because it was pretty clear to me that I didn't want to live under the thumb of those people, and I hesitate to use the word communist, but North Vietnamese or whatever. I mean, they're not exactly, there are a lot of boat people that died, and some got out of Vietnam. Why? I mean, we all know people vote with their feet. So, but whether or not it's incumbent upon the United States to be the world's policeman and say, well, we don't like the way the North Vietnamese are treating the South Vietnamese, so we're going to step in, that's a different story. We obviously decided to do that in Kuwait. We didn't decide to do that when Gaddafi invaded Chad. Perhaps that's because Chad doesn't have any oil. Perhaps it's because nobody invited us. I don't know. But those are political decisions.
And not for the military person.
Absolutely not. You know, the military is the point of the spear. And the military should be used that way. It should not be, you know, and that's it. You make the decision, whatever you're going to do, whether it's to throw Gaddafi out of Chad or throw Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, or to throw or to maintain the status quo in Vietnam as we did in Korea. Once you've made that decision, then leave it up to the military. That's their job. They screw it up, then they're responsible for it. But the military shouldn't make political decisions, as MacArthur tried to do in the 50s. But the political establishment shouldn't make military decisions the way Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon tried to do in the Vietnam era.
I can't think of anything else to add. Do you have anything else to add?
Nothing that I can think of. Except I'm glad things are going the way they are. Persian Gulf situation. I hope we've learned our lesson from Vietnam, and I hope it's a well-learned lesson.
It'll be interesting to see. My husband's with 101st. He's been over there since the end of August, and they just started having the family briefings for, as you abbreviated, PTSD.
Right.
And we got information sheets and all that kind of stuff on symptoms and what we should look for and how the family should act to the homecoming soldier, tips for the homecoming soldier and how to deal with the family,
That's
how
good.
to deal with the children.
That's good. My wife's a social worker. She wants me to come back home again because then she can fix all my problems and all that. It's hard. It is really hard. I mean, I don't know exactly what PTSD is and how it manifests itself in different individuals and so on and so forth. But I went to a party years and years ago when I was in Cincinnati before I went to work for Delta. And there was a psychiatrist, I think, that worked with the VA. I'd never heard of PTSD or any of that sort of stuff. And it really opened my eyes when he started telling me about some of the problems. And because I could see them in other people and stuff like that. But what really upset me was the fact that he said that the military knew about a lot of this. But because the world was divided, the United States was divided between hawks and doves. If you were to go to the American public and say, oh, by the way, a lot of these people coming back are having problems, and the reason they're having problems is because of this, because of that, it would be viewed as a peace deal. You know, the peace protesters would jump on that. So instead of doing something about it, they just buried it. So they essentially just took the American soldier and just dumped him in San Francisco and let him go.
Right. Yeah, I felt
Bad choice.
Just in general conversations I've had with people, not just people I've interviewed, but people I've met on active duty that were Vietnam vets and other Vietnam vets I've met over the years, I found that the people that have dealt with it the most are either one, people that stayed in the military afterwards, or two, those that had a support group, a strong support group when they came back. And from what your discussion of the Ravens is, you had that support group.
We had that support group that picked up later. See, I didn't have it at first because we didn't have a reunion until 3 or 4 or 5 years after I got back. But I got back from Southeast Asia, and I was a civilian in Ohio without even a military support group within a week. And I have a friend that I taught how to fly later, and we were talking about that much later, again, before any of this PTSD stuff came on. He said something about how pissed off I was for about a year. I said, oh, really? He said, were you ever? Which I'm sure is true. You know, because you can't just go from the war in Southeast Asia to being a junior executive for Procter & Gamble.
Yeah, that's it. Oh, wait, thanks.
And
It's to go up.
it was strange. It was a strange time.
One thing
Yeah. Are they here?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Okay. Well, I'd like to do
Don't
a
hurry.
close-up on your past.
Still
yeah,
to try to incorporate
15
what you did.
minutes.
Yeah.
Well, look at what maybe you could do if you could take them through and get them suited out in flight suits and
Yeah,
help.
we've unlocked
Because that's really more of
everybody.
a guy's job.
I think that's, because I read about it in the book and I thought, well, what's that look like?
Do we have everybody?
Now you know.
Everybody here?
Yeah. Okay. That's it. And
Yeah.
It's a lot of missions. As I look back on it, it didn't seem like so many at the time, but it's just sort of what you do.
Yeah.
what's C stand for?
What do we got? 446 missions, Southeast Asia.
Oh, okay. And those are the
Those are the airplanes, different types of airplanes.